The air in our Atlanta home hung heavy that morning, thick with the scent of burnt coffee and unspoken expectations. I stood by the kitchen counter, my fingers tracing the edge of a crisp envelope, the kind I'd grown used to preparing each month. $5,000. Not a fortune, but enough, I'd always told myself, to keep us afloat while Jack figured things out. The sunlight slanted through the blinds, casting jagged shadows across the linoleum floor, and I couldn't help but feel those shadows creeping into my thoughts too. Jack slouched at the table, his broad shoulders hunched over a half-empty mug. He hadn't shaved in days, and the stubble on his jaw gave him a rough edge that matched the tension in the room. I'd seen that look before, restless, brooding, like a storm waiting to break. But I'd learned to weather it, hadn't I? 5 years of marriage had taught me to read the clouds in his eyes, to gauge when to push and when to pull back. Today, though, there was something different, something sharper. Here, I said, sliding the envelope across the table. My voice was steady, practiced, same as always. He didn't look up right away. His fingers tapped a slow rhythm against the mug, a dull thud that echoed in the silence. Then he reached for the envelope, tearing it open with a flick of his thumb. The stack of bills fanned out in his hands, and for a moment, I let myself hope. Maybe this time he'd say something, anything, to show he appreciated it, that he saw how hard I worked to keep us going, how every late night at the firm chipped away at me. So he could have this. $5,000, he muttered, his voice low, almost a growl. He flipped through the bills, then tossed them onto the table like they were nothing. Same old song, huh, Emily? I felt a flicker of heat in my chest, but I swallowed it down. It's what we agreed on, Jack. You said you'd get back on your feet soon. That job at the garage. The garage! He cut me off, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, that fell through. Guess I'm still the deadbeat you're stuck with. Don't say that. My words came out sharper than I meant, and I caught myself softening my tone. I'm not stuck with you. I'm trying to help us. You've got potential, Jack. You always have. Potential. The word tasted bitter even as I said it, but I clung to it like a lifeline. I'd seen it in him once, the way he'd talk about fixing up cars, his hands moving with a kind of grace that made me believe he could build something out of nothing. I'd married that man. Not this one, the one who'd let unemployment stretch into months, then years, while I carried the weight of our life on my shoulders. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and I flinched despite myself. At 6'2", he towered over me, his frame filling the small kitchen. Potential don't pay the bills, Em, he said, stepping closer. And it sure as hell don't buy what I want. I frowned, my pulse quickening. What's that supposed to mean? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to the window, staring out at the patchy backyard where the grass had gone to seed. I followed his gaze, trying to see what he saw, but all I could feel was the distance growing between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, coiled like a spring. I need more, he said. 20 grand. Cash. The number hit me like a slap. $20,000? Jack, what are you talking about? A bike, he said, turning to face me. His eyes were hard now, glittering with something I didn't recognize. Saw it down at Miller's lot. Custom job. It's mine if I can get the money. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but it didn't come. He was serious. My mind raced, tallying up the hours I'd spent hunched over depositions, the weekends I'd sacrificed to make partner at the firm, all so we could scrape by. And now, a motorcycle? A toy? Jack, we can't afford that, I said, keeping my voice even. You know that. The mortgage, the utilities, it's all on me already. 5,000's the limit. The limit. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me, and I felt the air shift, grow heavier. You're telling me what I can have now? After everything. Everything. The word slipped out before I could stop it, laced with a bitterness I hadn't meant to show. What everything, Jack? I'm the one working. I'm the one keeping us from drowning. His jaw tightened, and for a second I thought he'd back off. He always had before. But then he moved, fast. His hand shot out, grabbing the envelope from the table and crumpling it in his fist. You think you're better than me, don't you? He said, his voice rising. Little Miss Lawyer, holding the purse strings, keeping me on a leash. Jack, stop it. I took a step back, my heart pounding now. That's not what this is. Then give me the money, he snapped. 20 grand. You've got it stashed somewhere, right? All those fancy clients, those late nights. Don't tell me you can't swing it. I can't, I said, and it was the truth. Every dollar I earned was accounted for, stretched thin across our life. And even if I could, I wouldn't. Not for this. His eyes narrowed, and I saw it then, the flash of something dark, something I'd never seen before. Rage, maybe, or desperation. He took another step, closing the gap between us, and I felt the counter press against my back. Nowhere to go. You wouldn't, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Guess I should have known. Always about you, isn't it, Em? I opened my mouth to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words didn't come. Instead, I watched as he turned away, his shoulders rigid, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it was over. A fight, sure, but we'd had worse. We'd get through it. Then I heard it, the scrape of metal against wood. My head whipped around just in time to see him pick up the baseball bat, leaning against the wall. It was an old thing, chipped and weathered, something he'd kept from his college days. He held it loosely at first, like he was testing its weight, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. Jack, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing? He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his eyes empty, and raised the bat. The bat hung in the air for a split second, its shadow slicing across the sunlight on the floor, and then it came down. Fast. Too fast for me to scream. Too fast for me to think. I threw my arms up, instinct kicking in, but the wood caught me square across the shoulder. Pain exploded like a gunshot, sharp and deafening, radiating down my arm and up into my skull. I stumbled back, the edge of the counter digging into my spine, and the kitchen spun around me, coffee mug tumbling, bills scattering like leaves in the wind. Jack. The word tore out of me, raw and ragged, but he didn't stop. His face was a mask, twisted with something I couldn't name. Fury, maybe, or something colder. He swung again, and this time I ducked, the bat whistling past my ear and smashing into the cabinet behind me. Glass shattered, raining down in jagged shards that glinted like teeth on the linoleum. My breath came in gasps, hot and shallow, as I scrambled sideways, my sneakers slipping on the debris. Stop it! I yelled, my voice cracking. What the hell are you doing? He didn't answer. His chest heaved, his knuckles white around the bat's grip. And for a moment, he just stood there, staring at me like I was a stranger. The man I'd slept beside for 5 years, the man I'd handed that envelope to not 10 minutes ago, he was gone. In his place was this thing, wild and unmoored, driven by a hunger I hadn't seen coming. $20,000. A motorcycle. That's what this was about. That's what turned him into this. I pressed myself against the wall, my shoulder throbbing, a dull ache spreading like ink through my chest. Blood trickled warm down my arm. I hadn't even realized I'd been cut until I saw the red smear on my sleeve. My mind raced, grasping for something to say, anything to pull him back. Jack, please, I said, softer now, my throat tight. This isn't you. You don't have to do this. His eyes flickered, and for a heartbeat, I thought I'd reached him. The bat lowered an inch, his grip loosening, and I saw a shadow of the man I'd trusted, the one I'd hoped could still climb out of the hole he'd dug for himself. But then his jaw clenched, and that shadow vanished. You don't get it, do you? He said, his voice low and venomous. I'm done begging, done waiting for your scraps. Scraps. The word hit me harder than the bat had. I straightened up despite the pain, my own anger flaring through the shock. I've given you everything I have, Jack. Everything. And you're ready to kill me over a damn bike. He flinched, just barely, but it was enough to tell me I'd struck a nerve. Good. Let him feel it. Let him see what he was doing. But instead of backing off, he stepped closer, the bat swinging idly at his side like a pendulum counting down to something awful. You think you're so high and mighty, he muttered. Think you can just say no, and that's it. Well, guess what? I'm taking what's mine. Yours. My voice trembled, but I held his gaze, refusing to look away. None of it's yours, Jack. Not the money, not me. You don't get to decide that. He froze, and the air between us thickened, heavy with the weight of what we'd just said. For a moment, I thought he'd drop the bat, walk out, leave me bruised but alive. I could almost picture it, him storming off, the door slamming, me sinking to the floor in a heap of relief and exhaustion. But then his lips curled into a sneer, and the bat came up again. I didn't wait to see where it landed. I bolted, shoving past the table, my hips slamming into the chair as I made for the living room. My shoulder screamed with every step, but adrenaline drowned it out, pushing me forward. The room stretched out before me, familiar yet alien in the chaos, our faded couch, the TV flickering with some morning show I'd left on, the coffee table littered with Jack's old car magazines. It was a snapshot of our life, and now it felt like a battlefield. I heard him behind me, his boots thudding against the floor, and I didn't dare look back. My hand reached for the phone on the side table, my lifeline, my way out, but before I could grab it, the bat swung again. This time, it caught me across the back, a sickening crack that sent me sprawling. I hit the carpet face first, tasting blood and dust, my vision swimming with black spots. Stay down, Emily, he growled, towering over me. His shadow swallowed the light, and I felt the weight of it pressing me into the floor. You should have just given me the money. I coughed, pain lancing through my ribs, and rolled onto my side. My arm hung useless, numb from the shoulder down, but my mind was sharp clawing through the haze. He thought he'd won. He thought I'd break, but as I looked up at him, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with a victory he didn't deserve, something shifted inside me. The shock was still there, a jagged edge cutting through my thoughts, but beneath it, something hotter was rising. Anger, not the fleeting kind I'd felt in the kitchen, but something deep, something that burned. You're wrong, I said, my voice hoarse but steady. You don't get to take anything from me. His brow furrowed, like he couldn't believe I'd dared to speak. He raised the bat again, but this time I didn't flinch. I held his stare, my breath ragged, my body screaming, and I knew right then that this wasn't over. Not for him, and sure as hell not for me. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and regret, a sterile tang that stung my nose as I blinked awake. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, unforgiving glow across the cracked linoleum floor. My body felt like it had been run through a shredder. Every breath sent a sharp jolt through my ribs, and my left arm hung limp in a sling, the dull throb in my shoulder a constant reminder of Jack's bat. I shifted on the stiff mattress at Grady Memorial, the thin blanket rasping against my skin, and stared at the ceiling. Tiles. White, endless tiles. They blurred as my eyes watered, not from pain, but from the weight of what had happened. I could still hear his voice, that low growl, stay down, Emily, echoing in my skull. I could still see the sneer on his face, the way he'd loomed over me, like some kind of conqueror. And that bat, swinging like it had a will of its own. My hand clenched into a fist, the four-needle tugging at my skin, and I winced. How had it come to this? 5 years of marriage, 5 years of pouring myself into him, into us, and it ended with me sprawled on our living room floor, bleeding and broken. For a motorcycle, $20,000 I didn't even have. The door creaked open, and a nurse slipped in, her sneakers squeaking softly against the floor. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with tired eyes and a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Mrs. Brennan," she said, her voice gentle but clipped, like she'd said it a dozen times already that day. "You're awake. How's the pain?" I swallowed, my throat dry as sandpaper. "Manageable." I lied. She didn't need to know the truth, that the ache in my chest wasn't just from the bruises. She nodded, jotting something down, then adjusted the foredrip with a practiced flick of her fingers. "Doctor'll be in soon," she said. "You're lucky, could have been worse." Lucky. The word hit me like a slap, but I forced a tight smile. "Yeah, lucky." She didn't catch the edge in my voice, or if she did, she didn't care. She just nodded again and slipped out, leaving me alone with the hum of the machines and the chaos in my head. I turned my gaze to the window. It was small, smudged with fingerprints, and framed a gray slice of Atlanta's skyline, towers piercing the overcast sky, a city that didn't care about the mess I'd landed in. My reflection stared back at me, faint and distorted, pale skin, dark circles under my eyes, a bandage taped across my forehead. I looked like a stranger, felt like one, too. The Emily Harper who'd walked into that kitchen yesterday morning, envelope in hand, full of quiet hope. She was gone. What was left was this battered shell, piecing together what to do next. The phone sat on the rolling tray beside me, a clunky hospital model with a coiled cord. I reached for it with my good hand, ignoring the twinge in my side, and dialed the only number I could think of. Claire Montgomery, my college roommate turned corporate lawyer, the one person who'd never judged me for sticking with Jack, even when everyone else whispered I should have left years ago. The line rang twice before her voice cut through, crisp and familiar. "Emily? Jesus, it's early. You okay?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words stuck. Was I okay? No, not even close. My lips trembled, and I pressed them together, forcing the tremor down. "Claire," I said, finally, my voice hoarse. "I'm at Grady. I I need you." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath on her end. "Grady Memorial? What the hell happened? Are you hurt?" "Jack," I said, and that was all it took. His name carried the weight of everything. The bat, the blood, the betrayal. I didn't need to explain further. Claire knew enough about our cracks to fill in the blanks. "Stay put," she said, her tone shifting into that no-nonsense gear she used in courtrooms. "I'm on my way. Don't talk to anyone, cops, doctors, nobody, until I get there. You hear me?" "Yeah," I whispered. "Thanks, Claire." She hung up without another word, and I let the receiver drop back into its cradle. My hand lingered on it, the plastic cool against my palm, grounding me as my mind spun. Jack was gone. I didn't know where, out the door after he'd left me crumpled on the carpet, probably halfway across the city by now with that damn bat still in his grip. The thought of him out there, free while I lay here, sparked something hot and jagged in my chest. Anger, sure, but something else too. A need, a hunger I hadn't felt before. I'd trusted him, believed in him. Even after the jobs dried up, after the late nights at bars he couldn't afford, I'd told myself he'd find his way back. That the Jack I'd fallen for, the one with grease-stained hands and a crooked grin, was still in there somewhere. But that Jack was a ghost, and the man who'd swung at me yesterday wasn't worth my hope. He'd crossed a line, and now I had to decide mine. The door swung open again, but it wasn't Claire. A man stepped in, tall and broad-shouldered, his navy windbreaker emblazoned with Atlanta PD in stark white letters. He had a notepad in one hand, a pen in the other, and a look on his face that said he'd seen rooms like this too many times. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I'm Detective Sullivan. Got a call about an assault. Mind if I ask you some questions?" My pulse spiked, Claire's warning ringing in my ears. Don't talk to anyone. But he was here now, standing between me and the door, and the weight of his badge felt like a spotlight pinning me down. I glanced at the phone, then back at him, my good hand tightening on the blanket. I, I'd rather wait, I said, keeping my tone even. "My lawyer's on her way." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't push. "Fair enough," he said, tucking the pen behind his ear. "I'll be around. You change your mind, just holler." He stepped back, leaving the door ajar, and I caught a glimpse of the hallway, nurses bustling, a gurney rattling past. Power out there, order, structure. In here, just me and the wreckage of my choices. I leaned back against the pillow, closing my eyes. My shoulder ached, my ribs burned, but it was the ache inside that cut deepest. Jack had wanted to take something from me, money, control, maybe even my life. And he'd almost succeeded. Almost. The word stuck with me, rolling around in my head like a challenge. He'd fled, left me for dead, but I was still here, still breathing. And that meant I had something he didn't expect. A chance. Claire would get here soon. She'd have a plan, a way to turn this mess into something I could fight with. But as I lay there, the hospital's hum filling the silence, I felt a shift in myself. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about making him pay. Not with fists or bats. That wasn't me, but with something sharper. Justice, maybe, or revenge. The line between them blurred in my mind, and I wasn't sure I cared which one I'd choose. My phone buzzed on the tray. A cheap burner I didn't recognize, probably slipped in by a nurse with my things. I grabbed it, wincing as I shifted, and saw the text. Asterisk, you should have said yes. M, this isn't over. Asterisk, no name, but I didn't need one. Jack's voice slithered through those words, cold and taunting, and my stomach twisted. He was out there, watching, waiting. The threat hung in the air, heavier than the antiseptic smell. And I realized he wasn't done with me yet. Neither was I with him. The precinct smelled like stale coffee and desperation, a sharp contrast to the sterile bite of the hospital room I'd left behind. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the Atlanta PD's interview room, my good hand gripping the edge of the table, the other still cradled uselessly in its sling. The walls were a dull gray, scuffed and peeling at the corners, and a fluorescent bulb flickered overhead, casting a jittery light that made my head throb. Across from me, Claire Montgomery leaned forward, her tailored blazer crisp against the chaos of the room. Her eyes locked on Detective Sullivan like she was sizing him up for a cross-examination. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, tight and unyielding, as the weight of Jack's text burned a hole in my pocket. Asterisk, you should have said yes. M, this isn't over. Asterisk Sullivan stood by the door, arms crossed, his windbreaker rustling faintly as he shifted his weight. He'd swapped the notepad for a manila folder, its edges worn and creased, and he tapped it against his thigh like a metronome keeping time to my unraveling life. The room felt too small, the air too thick, pressing in on me from all sides. I could still hear the echo of Jack's boots thudding across our living room floor, the crack of that bat against my ribs, a sound that played on a loop in my skull, louder now in this concrete box where power hung like a storm cloud. "Mrs. Brennan," Sullivan started, his voice cutting through the hum of my thoughts. "I need you to walk me through it again. Everything you remember." Claire's hand shot up, palm out, before I could even open my mouth. "She's already given her statement at the hospital. Detective, you've got the report. Broken ribs? dislocated shoulder, contusions. What more do you need? Sullivan didn't flinch. Details, counselor. I need details. Your client's husband's in the wind, and I've got a beat up woman sitting here with a story that ends in a 911 call. You want him caught. I need more than he hit me and ran. I swallowed hard. My throat dry despite the chipped mug of water Claire had shoved in front of me. The memory of Jack's face, twisted, unrecognizable, flashed behind my eyes, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Not fear, not anymore. Something hotter. Something that made my fingers twitch against the table. He didn't just hit me, I said, my voice low but steady, cutting through the standoff between Claire and Sullivan. He tried to break me. Over $20,000 he thought I owed him for a motorcycle. Sullivan's brow furrowed, and he flipped open the folder, scribbling something on a yellow legal pad inside. A bike? That's what set him off. Yeah. I leaned back, wincing as my ribs protested. I gave him $5,000 a month, every month, to keep him going while he figured things out. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more, and when I said no, he picked up the bat. The words hung there, heavy and jagged, and I saw Claire's jaw tighten out of the corner of my eye. She'd heard the short version on the drive over, me spilling it in broken fragments while she maneuvered her BMW through Atlanta's lunchtime traffic. But this was different. Saying it here, in this room, with Sullivan's pen scratching across the page, made it real. Too real. $5,000 a month, Sullivan repeated, glancing up at me. That's a hell of a lifeline. What's he do for work? Nothing, I said, and the bitterness in my voice surprised even me. Hasn't in years. I'm the one pulling 60-hour weeks at the firm. He just takes. Sullivan nodded, like he'd heard that story 1,000 times before, and maybe he had. So he snaps, swings the bat, then bolts. Any idea where he'd go? I opened my mouth to say no, but then I stopped. Where would Jack go? I'd spent 5 years mapping the edges of his life, his habits, his haunts, but now, staring down the barrel of this moment, I realized how little I knew. The bars he'd stumble out of at closing time, the garage where he'd tinker with friends' cars for beer money, or maybe somewhere new, somewhere I'd never touched. The thought gnawed at me, a splinter under my skin. I don't know. I admitted, my voice quieter now. He's got friends, maybe people he'd crash with. But he's not stupid. He'll stay low. Claire cut in, her tone sharp. Which is why you need to move fast, detective. He's already threatened her. Text message, burner phone. He's not done. Sullivan's eyes flicked to me, narrowing. Threatened you? When? I hesitated, my hand sliding to my pocket, where the phone sat like a live grenade. Claire gave me a nod, firm and insistent, and I pulled it out, sliding it across the table. The screen glowed faintly, Jack's words staring up at us. Asterisk, you should have said yes, M. This isn't over. Asterisk, Sullivan read it, his expression hardening. Timestamps an hour ago. You didn't think to mention this sooner. I was a little busy bleeding. I snapped, then caught myself pressing my lips together. The anger was there, simmering just under my skin, but I couldn't let it spill over. Not yet. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he pocketed the phone. Evidence now, I guessed, and leaned against the wall, studying me. All right. He's escalating. That's clear. But here's the thing, Mrs. Brennan. I can't do much unless you're straight with me. You holding anything back? The question hit me like a punch, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. Holding back. I'd laid it all out. The money, the bat, the way Jack's eyes had gone dead as he swung. But then I thought about the years before, the slow rot of our marriage, the way I'd let it fester because I convinced myself I could fix him. Was that what Sullivan meant? The guilt I'd swallowed every time I wrote him a check, telling myself it was love, not cowardice? No, I said, finally meeting his gaze. That's everything. He held my stare for a beat longer, then nodded. Okay, we'll trace the text, see if it pings anywhere. Meanwhile, you've got a choice to make. Press charges. We go after him hard. Assault, attempted robbery, maybe more if that threat holds up. Or you walk away, hope he disappears. Your call. Claire's hand landed on my arm, firm but warm. Emily, you don't have to decide now. But he's not going to stop. You know that. I did. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a certainty as cold and hard as the table under my fingers. Jack wasn't done because I'd said no, because I'd stood up to him, even as I hit the floor. And that text, it wasn't just a taunt, it was a promise. My mind spun, torn between the woman I'd been yesterday, scared, scrambling to survive, and the one sitting here now, bruised but alive, with a fire I hadn't known I could carry. I want him found, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. I want him stopped. Sullivan gave a curt nod, like he'd expected that answer all along. Good. We'll need a formal statement. Then we can. The door burst open, cutting him off. A uniformed officer stuck his head in, breathless. Sullivan, we got a hit. Burner phone pinged a tower off Peachtree, near the old warehouse district. Patrol's rolling now. My heart lurched, slamming against my cracked ribs. Peachtree. Not far, just a few miles from our house, from the firm, from the life I'd built, and he'd tried to shatter. He hadn't even run far. The thought sent a jolt through me, equal parts fear and fury. He was still here, still close, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Sullivan straightened, already moving for the door. Stay here, he barked over his shoulder. Both of you. I'll call when we've got something. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me and Claire in a silence that buzzed louder than the fluorescent lights. She turned to me, her eyes searching mine. You okay? No, I said, and it was the truth. My shoulder ached, my head pounded, but it was the shift inside me that hurt most. The shock was fading, peeling back to reveal something raw and jagged underneath. Pain, yes, from the attack, from the betrayal. But anger too, sharp burning, and mine. And determination. A quiet steel I hadn't felt before, threading through the mess of me. He's not getting away with this, I said, more to myself than to her. Not this time. Claire squeezed my arm, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Damn right he's not. We'll nail him, M. Whatever it takes. I nodded, staring at the spot where Sullivan had stood, the folder still open on the table, Jack's name scrawled across the top. Whatever it takes. The words settled into me, heavy and sure, as the precinct's hum swallowed the silence. This was the turn, my turn. Jack had swung that bat, thinking he'd won, thinking he'd broken me. But he hadn't. He'd lit a fuse instead, and now I was the one holding the match. The night settled over Claire's apartment like a heavy blanket, the kind that smothers more than it warms. I sat on her leather couch, legs tucked beneath me, a glass of bourbon cradled in my good hand. The ice clinked softly against the sides, a faint rhythm that matched the dull ache pulsing through my ribs. Claire's place was all sharp edges and modern lines, glass coffee table, polished hardwood floors, a skyline view of Atlanta glittering through floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a world away from the chipped linoleum and faded curtains of my house, but it didn't feel like refuge. Not tonight. The precinct's gray walls still clung to me, Sullivan's questions echoing in my head, and Jack's text, asterisk, this isn't over, asterisk, burned behind my eyes like a brand. Claire paced the open kitchen, her heels clicking against the tiles, phone pressed to her ear. She'd been on with her paralegal for the last 10 minutes, barking orders about pulling records, digging into Jack's past. Anything that might give us an edge. Her voice was a low, steady hum, the kind of controlled fury I'd seen her wield in courtrooms, but it couldn't pierce the fog wrapping around me. I stared at the amber liquid in my glass, watching it catch the light, and tried to focus on the sting of bourbon on my tongue instead of the weight pressing on my chest. You sure you're up for this? Claire's voice cut through, sharper now, as she set her phone down on the counter. She leaned against the island, arms crossed, her dark eyes pinning me with that lawyer's stare, part concern, part challenge. I didn't look up right away. My fingers tightened around the glass, the cold biting into my palm. Up for what? Sitting here while he's out there plotting God knows what. She sighed, a sound that carried more exasperation than pity, and crossed the room to drop into the armchair across from me. You know what I mean, Em? You're not just bruised, you're shaken. I get it, but if we're going after him, you need to be all in. No halfway. Her words landed like a jab, and I felt that familiar heat flare in my gut. Shaken. She wasn't wrong. The shock of Jack's attack still lingered, a jagged edge that caught me every time I moved, every time I breathed. But beneath it, something else was growing, something molten, something that made me want to smash this glass against her pristine floor just to hear it shatter. I set it down instead, carefully on the table between us. I'm in, I said, meeting her gaze. He doesn't get to do this, and walk away. Not after. I stopped, the memory of the bat flashing bright and brutal, his sneer as he towered over me. My voice dropped, steady but laced with venom. Not after he made me feel like nothing. Claire nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes, but before she could respond, my phone buzzed on the cushion beside me. Not the burner, the one Sullivan had taken, but my real phone, the one I'd barely touched since Grady. The screen lit up with an unknown number, and my stomach twisted, a cold not tightening fast. I stared at it, the buzz rattling through the silence, and Claire's head snapped toward me. Don't, she said, reaching for it, but I was faster. My good hand snatched it up, my thumb hovering over the answer button. My heart slammed against my ribs, loud enough I swore she could hear it. It's him, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. That same certainty I'd felt in the precinct, the one that told me Jack wasn't done. Claire's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue, just leaned closer, her hand hovering like she might yank the phone away if I faltered. I pressed answer and held it to my ear, my breath shallow. Static crackled for a second. Then his voice slithered through, low and deliberate, like he'd rehearsed it. Hey, Em. The sound of him, casual, almost soft, hit me like a punch. My mouth went dry, and I gripped the phone harder, the edge digging into my palm. Jack, I said, forcing my voice to stay even. What do you want? A chuckle, faint but sharp, cut through the line. What do I want? Come on, you know me better than that. I want what's mine. You didn't think I'd just let it go, did you? Claire's eyes narrowed, and she mouthed, asterisk, keep him talking. Asterisk, I nodded, swallowing the bile, rising in my throat. You mean the money? The bike. You broke my ribs over a fantasy, Jack. There's nothing left to take. He laughed again, louder this time, and I could picture him leaning against some grimy wall, that bat propped nearby, his stubble catching the dim light of wherever he'd hold up. You always thought small, Em. That's your problem. It's not just the bike. It's everything. You, me, the life you tried to squeeze me out of. I'm not done yet. The room tilted, the glittering skyline outside blurring as his words sank in. Not just the bike. Me, the life. 5 years of marriage twisted into something he could claim, something he could swing a bat at when it didn't bend his way. My free hand clenched into a fist, nails biting into my skin, and I felt that fire in my chest roar higher. You're insane, I said, my voice trembling, but not from fear, not anymore. You think you can threaten me after what you did. The cops are looking for you. They've got your text, your number, Burner, sweetheart, he cut in, smug as ever. They won't find me. Not unless I want them to. And you? You're not safe, Em. Not at Claire's fancy little penthouse. Not anywhere. You should have said yes. The line went dead, a sharp click that echoed in my skull. I dropped the phone onto the couch, my hand shaking, and stared at it like it might bite. Claire was on her feet in an instant, snatching it up and hitting redial, but the call bounced straight to nothing, disconnected, gone. She cursed under her breath, tossing it back down, and turned to me. He knows you're here, she said, her voice tight. How the hell does he know that? I didn't answer right away. My mind raced, rewinded Jack's habits, his haunts, the way he'd always had a knack for sniffing out what I didn't want him to know. Had he followed me from the hospital, watched me limp into Claire's building? Or worse, had he been tracking me longer, waiting for the moment I'd let my guard down? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but it wasn't fear that gripped me now. It was realization, cold and clear, cutting through the haze. He's been watching, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside. He's not running. He's playing. Claire's eyes widened, then hardened. Then we play back. I'm calling Sullivan. We need that trace now. She grabbed her phone, already dialing, but I barely heard her. My gaze drifted to the windows. The city sprawled out below like a chessboard, each light a piece in a game I hadn't known I was playing. Jack wasn't just some desperate thug lashing out. He was calculated, driven by something deeper than a motorcycle or 20 grand. Pride, maybe, or spite. The life I built, the firm, the money, the stability, he'd always resented it, hadn't he? Every check I wrote, every late night I worked, it wasn't just support to him. It was a reminder he'd failed where I hadn't. And now he wanted to tear it down. The shock from the attack, that raw, reeling pain. It was still there, a bruise on my soul as much as my body. But it was shifting, hardening into something else. Anger. Yes, blazing and bright, but determination too, a steel thread weaving through me. He thought he could scare me, break me again with a phone call and a threat. He was wrong. I'd trusted him once, poured my hope into him, and he'd turned it into a weapon. Not again. Claire's voice snapped me back, sharp and urgent. Sullivan's on it. They're pulling the tower data, now. He says to sit tight, but she stopped, studying me, her brow furrowing. In Iorpali, you need to rest. No, I said, standing despite the stab in my ribs, the room swaying for a second before steadying. I need to know why. Why he's doing this. It's not just money. It's personal. She didn't argue, just nodded, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Okay, then let's figure it out. What's he after? Really? I paced to the window, my reflection staring back at me, bandaged, battered, but upright. My mind churned, digging into the cracks of our past. The fights over my job, the way he'd sneer at my suits, my late hours, the garage dreams he'd abandoned, blaming me because I didn't get it. The resentment that simmered every time I paid a bill he couldn't. It wasn't just about taking. It was about proving something to me, to himself. He hates that I made it. I said, realization dawning like a cold dawn. That I didn't need him. He wants me to feel small again, like he does. Claire stepped beside me, her reflection joining mine. Then he's in for a hell of a surprise. You're not small, not anymore. I turned to her, the fire in my chest steady now, a beacon in the dark. No, I'm not. And he's going to find out what that costs him. The phone sat silent on the couch, but its weight lingered, a dare I was ready to answer. Jack thought he held the power, thought he could keep me running. But the game had changed. I wasn't his wife anymore, wasn't his victim. I was his reckoning. The silence in Claire's apartment stretched thin, taut as a wire ready to snap. I stood by the window, my good hand pressed against the cool glass, the city's lights blurring into streaks of gold and shadow below. My reflection stared back, pale, hollow-eyed, a woman I barely recognized, but the fire in my chest hadn't dimmed. Jack's voice still echoed in my ears, that smug, taunting drawl from the phone call earlier tonight. Asterisk, you're not safe, M. Not anywhere. Asterisk, it wasn't just a threat. It was a gauntlet thrown down, and every fiber of me ached to pick it up, to shove it back in his face. But the ache in my ribs, the dull throb in my shoulder, they reminded me how close he'd come to breaking me already, how close I'd come to letting him. Claire's heels clicked behind me, sharp and deliberate, as she crossed the room with her phone in hand. "Sullivan's got something," she said, her voice cutting through the haze. Patrol picked up a signal from that burner. Warehouse district, like before, but they lost it. He's slippery, too damn slippery. I turned from the window, my breath catching as my ribs protested the movement. Lost it? What does that mean? They had him. Claire, he was right there. She set the phone down on the glass coffee table, its screen dark now, and fixed me with a look that was all steel. It means he's not some dumb thug stumbling around. He's got a plan, and he's playing it out. Sullivan's pulling more units, but we're not waiting on them to figure this out. You need to decide what you're doing, right now. The room felt smaller suddenly, the sleek lines of Claire's penthouse closing in like the walls of that precinct interview room. I could still smell the stale coffee, feel the weight of Sullivan's folder on the table, hear his gruff voice asking if I was holding anything back. And now here I was, hours later, with Jack's threat hanging over me like a noose, and Claire pushing me to move, when all I wanted was to scream. My hand tightened into a fist, nails digging into my palm, and I welcomed the sting. It grounded me, kept me from spiraling into the panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I already decided. I said, my voice low but steady. I told Sullivan, I want him stopped. I meant it. Claire's eyes narrowed, searching mine, saying it's one thing, doing it's another. He knows where you are, he's watching, and he's not afraid to come closer. You ready for that? Was I? The question hit me hard, and for a second, I saw Jack sneer again, the bat swinging down, the crack of it against my body. My knees wobbled, but I locked them, forcing myself to stand taller despite the pain. I don't have a choice, I said. He's not giving me one. I'm not running, Claire. Not from him. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded, a flicker of something, pride, maybe crossing her face. All right, then we push harder. I've got my people digging into his past, debts, buddies, anything we can use. But you need to report this call to Sullivan. Officially. It's more fuel for the fire. I hesitated, my gaze drifting back to the phone on the couch. That cheap, clunky thing that had carried Jack's voice into this sanctuary, turning it into a battleground. Reporting it meant dragging this mess deeper into the open, letting the cops peel back more layers of my life with Jack. Every fight, every check, every moment I'd let slide because I thought I could fix him. Shame twisted in my gut, sharp and cold, but I shoved it down. No more hiding. No more pretending this was just a bad day I could smooth over. Okay, I said finally, crossing to the couch and picking up the phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed Sullivan's number, the one he'd scrawled on a card back at the precinct. Each ring felt like a heartbeat, loud and unsteady, until his voice growled through the line. Sullivan. It's Emily Brennan, I said, keeping my tone flat despite the churn in my stomach. He called me. Jack. Tonight, maybe an hour ago. A pause, then the faint scratch of a pen. What did he say? I swallowed, the words sticking like glass in my throat. That I'm not safe. That this isn't over. He knew I was at Claire's. He's watching me. Sullivan cursed under his breath. A low, rough sound that carried more weight than I'd expected. All right, you got the number he called from. It's my phone, not the burner, I said, glancing at Claire, who nodded encouragement. Unknown caller, but it's logged. He said it won't trace. He's using burners, but he's close. I can feel it. Feelings don't catch him, Mrs. Brennan. Sullivan said, blunt but not unkind. Facts do. I'll send a unit to Montgomery's building, sweep the area. You stay put, keep the doors locked. We're close. He's slipping up, calling you like that. Means he's getting cocky. Cocky. The word stuck with me as I hung up, the phone slipping from my hand onto the cushion. Jack, cocky, leaning into his threats like he owned me, like he could still bend me to his will. My jaw clenched, and I felt that fire flare again, hotter now, licking at the edges of my fear. He thought he had the upper hand, thought he could keep me scrambling. But every call, every move, he was giving me more to use against him. Claire watched me, her arms crossed, the skyline casting long shadows across her face. What's going through your head? Em? I didn't answer right away. My eyes drifted to the window again, to the city that held Jack somewhere in its depths. The warehouse district wasn't far, gritty, sprawling, full of dark corners where a man like him could hide. I pictured him there, hunched in some abandoned building, the bat propped against a wall, smirking as he dialed my number. The image made my skin crawl, but it also sharpened something inside me, a resolve I hadn't known I could muster. He's pushing me, I said, my voice quiet but firm, testing how far I'll bend before I break. He doesn't know I'm already past that. Claire stepped closer, her expression softening just a fraction. You're not breaking. You're fighting. That's the difference now. I nodded, but the weight of it settled heavy on my shoulders. Fighting. It sounded noble, clean, like something out of a courtroom drama Claire might star in. But this didn't feel clean. It felt raw, messy, a tangle of anger and pain and a hunger I couldn't name, justice, maybe, or revenge, or both twisted together until I couldn't tell them apart. I wanted Jack caught, locked away, his smug face wiped clean by a cell door slamming shut. But part of me, a part one didn't want to look at too closely, wanted him to hurt, to feel the terror he'd shoved into me when that bat came down. Before I could say more, a sharp knock rattled the door, and I flinched, my heart lurching into my throat. Claire's hand shot out, steadying me, her eyes darting to the entrance. That's probably Sullivan's unit, she said, but her voice held an edge, a crack of caution. She crossed the room, peering through the peephole, then opened the door to reveal two uniformed officers, their radios crackling faintly. Mrs. Montgomery, the taller one said, his badge glinting under the hallway lights. Detective Sullivan sent us. We're sweeping the building and the block. You two stay inside, lock everything. Claire nodded, stepping aside as they briefed her, but my gaze drifted past them, down the hallway toward the elevator. Empty, silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, a prickling at the back of my neck. Jack was out there, closer than I wanted to admit, and this fancy apartment with its locked doors and skyline view didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like a cage. The officers left, their boots echoing down the corridor, and Claire bolted the door behind them, turning to me with a look that said she felt it too, the pressure building, the walls closing in. They'll find him, she said, but it sounded more like a hope than a promise. I sank back onto the couch, my good hand rubbing at my temple where a headache was blooming. And if they don't, if he gets here first, then we're ready, she said, her voice hard now, a lawyer's confidence snapping into place. He's not walking through that door without a fight. I wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to that steel in her tone. But as the night deepened, the city's hum filtering through the glass, I couldn't shake the image of Jack out there, watching, waiting, his bat tapping idly against his leg. The crisis wasn't just escalating, it was crashing down, and I was caught in the center, battered but unbowed, my anger sharpening into something lethal. He'd swung that bat thinking he'd won. He'd called me thinking he'd scare me silent. But I wasn't silent. I wasn't done. And when the moment came, when he stepped out of the shadows, I'd be the one standing, ready to make him pay. The air in Claire's apartment had turned thick, almost suffocating, as the clock ticked past midnight. I stood by the window again, my breath fogging the glass, my good hand pressed against it like I could push through to the city beyond and grab Jack by the throat myself. The skyline glittered, indifferent, while my heart hammered a rhythm I couldn't steady. His voice from that call, asterisk, "You're not safe, M. Not anywhere, asterisk, looped in my head, a taunt that wouldn't let go. The cops were out there, sweeping the block, but it didn't feel like enough. Not with him so close, his shadow stretching longer with every second that passed. Claire sat on the couch now, her phone glowing in her hand, thumbs flying as she texted Sullivan for updates. Her blazer was off, tossed over the armrest, and her sleeves were rolled up, a soldier ready for war. She glanced up at me, her eyes sharp despite the late hour. "You should sit, Em. Pacing's not doing you any good." "I can't," I said, my voice rough, scraped raw by the tension coiled inside me. "He's out there, Claire. Watching. I can feel it." My fingers curled against the glass, nails scraping faintly, and I hated how small I sounded, how much like the Emily he'd expected me to be, scared, shrinking, waiting for someone else to fix this. She set the phone down, leaning forward, elbows on her knees. "Then let him watch. Let him see you standing there, not running. He's the one who should be scared now." Her words hit me, a spark against the dry tinder of my anger, and I turned to face her. He's not scared. He's cocky, thinks he's untouchable because he's got me jumping at shadows. My good hand clenched into a fist, the sling on my other arm pulling tight as my shoulder twitched. But I'm done jumping. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed again, loud and insistent against the glass table. She snatched it up, her brow furrowing as she read. "Sullivan," she said, her voice tightening. "They've got a lead. That burner pinged again. Same tower, warehouse district. They're closing in." My stomach lurched, a mix of relief and dread slamming into me. "Closing in? They've got him." "Not yet," she said, standing now, her heels clicking as she crossed to me. "But they're narrowing it down, abandoned buildings off Peachtree. He's holed up somewhere, and they're going door to door. Sullivan's heading the team. Peachtree, that gritty sprawl of rusted metal and broken windows, just a few miles from here. I could picture it, Jack crouched in some shadowed corner, the bat resting across his knees, that smirk still plastered on his face. The image ignited something in me, a blaze that burned through the fear, threatening to choke me. He was close, too close, and the cops were on his tail. But it wasn't enough to wait, to hope they'd drag him out in cuffs. I needed more. I needed him to know I wasn't breaking. "Tell Sullivan about the call," I said, stepping away from the window, my voice steadier now. "Tell him Jack's not just hiding. He's hunting. He's not going to sit there waiting to be caught." Claire nodded, already typing, but her eyes flicked to me with a question she didn't ask. I didn't need her to. I could feel it in the air between us. The shift, the moment where this stopped being about survival and started being about something sharper, something I could wield. My ribs ached, my shoulder screamed, but the pain was fuel now, feeding the fire I'd let smolder too long. The room felt charged, the hum of the city outside sinking with the pulse in my ears, when the phone in my pocket buzzed again. My real phone, not the burner Sullivan had taken. I froze, my hand hovering over it, and Claire's head snapped up. "Don't," she said, but it was too late. I pulled it out, the screen lighting up with another unknown number, and my blood turned to ice. It's him, I whispered, the certainty sinking into my bones like lead. Claire lunged for it, but I held it out of reach, my thumb hitting answer before I could second guess myself. I pressed it to my ear, my breath shallow, and waited. Jack's voice slithered through, low and deliberate, just like before. You holding up okay over there? Bet Claire's got you all cozy. Huh? The casualness of it, the way he said her name like he owned it, sent a shiver down my spine, but I clenched my jaw, refusing to let it show. What do you want, Jack? I said, my voice cold, harder than I'd expected. Cops are on your ass. You're running out of time. A laugh, short and sharp, crackled through the line. Cops? Those clowns. They're chasing their tails. Sweetheart, I've got eyes on you right now. Pretty view from up there. All those lights. You think a few badges are going to stop me? My heart slammed against my ribs, and I spun back to the window, scanning the skyline. The towers stretched out, a sea of glowing windows and dark rooftops. And somewhere out there, he was watching. My throat tightened, but I forced my voice to stay steady. You're bluffing. You're desperate, and it's pathetic. Desperate. His tone darkened, an edge creeping in. You're the one hiding behind your lawyer friend, pretending you're tough. But I know you, Em. I heard you scream when that bat came down. You're not fooling anyone. The memory flashed, bright and brutal, the crack of wood against bone, and my knees buckled for a split second. But I caught myself, gripping the edge of the window frame, the glass cold under my palm. He wanted me to crumble, to hear that scream again, in my voice. I wouldn't give it to him. You don't know me anymore, I said, my words slow, deliberate. You lost that when you swung. Keep talking, Jack. Every word's another nail in your coffin. Claire was beside me now, her hand on my arm, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and fear. She mouthed, hang up, but I shook her off, my focus locked on the call, on the game he thought he was winning. Coffin, he sneered. Big talk from a scared little girl. You think they'll catch me before I get to you? I'm closer than you know, closer than those cops'll ever be. The line went dead, a sharp click that echoed in the silence, and I dropped the phone onto the table like it burned. My hands shook, but not just from fear. Anger roared through me, white hot and searing, drowning out the echo of his taunt. Closer than I knew. He was here, in the shadows of the city, daring me to flinch. He's outside, I said, my voice trembling with the force of it, turning to Claire. He's watching us right now. Her face hardened, and she grabbed her phone, dialing Sullivan without hesitation. He just called her again. She snapped when he picked up. Says he's close, watching the building. Get your people here, now. I didn't hear Sullivan's reply. My eyes were back on the window, searching the darkness beyond Claire's reflection. A woman with a sling and a fire in her stare. The city loomed, a labyrinth of steel and secrets. And somewhere in it, Jack was circling, his bat tapping out a rhythm only he could hear. The cops were coming, sure, but this wasn't their fight anymore. It was mine. I stepped back, my good hand curling into a fist, and felt the shift inside me snap into place. The shock, the pain, the betrayal, they'd carved me hollow, but what filled that space now was something new. Not just anger, not just determination, but a clarity so sharp it cut. I wasn't the Emily he'd married, the one who'd handed him checks and hope in equal measure. I wasn't even the Emily he'd left bleeding on the floor. I was something else, someone who'd survived him, who'd turned his weapon into her own. He's wrong, I said, more to myself than to Claire, as her voice faded into the background, barking orders to Sullivan. I'm not scared. Not of him. The room pulsed with tension, the air heavy with the weight of what was coming. Jack thought he held the power, thought he could keep me cowering with a phone call and a threat, but he misjudged me. Every swing, every word. He'd forged this version of me, the one who wouldn't bend, wouldn't break. And now, as the distant wail of sirens cut through the night, I knew it wasn't just about catching him anymore. It was about facing him, about standing in the wreckage he'd made and showing him what I'd become. The climax was here, crashing down like a wave I couldn't outrun. But I didn't want to. I'd meet it head on, battered but unbowed. And when the dust settled, Jack would see the cost of crossing me. The bat was his. The fight was mine. The sirens grew louder, slicing through the thick night air outside Claire's apartment, their wail a jagged pulse that synced with the pounding in my chest. I stood by the window, my good hand gripping the frame, the cold glass biting into my palm as I stared out at the city, Atlanta's sprawling maze of lights and shadows, a battlefield I'd never meant to fight on. My reflection flickered in the pain, pale, bruised, eyes sharp with something I hadn't recognized until tonight. The sling hung heavy on my shoulder, a reminder of Jack's bat, but it didn't weigh me down anymore. It fueled me. Claire's voice cut through the tension behind me, sharp and urgent, as she barked into her phone. Sullivan, he's here, right now. He called her again, said he's watching. You need to move faster. She paused, her heels clicking as she paced, then snapped. Good. We're not going anywhere. The line clicked dead, and she turned to me, her face a mask of controlled fury. They've got a lock on him. Tower pinged again, 2 blocks away. Sullivan's team is closing the net. 2 blocks. My breath caught, a cold jolt running down my spine. But it wasn't fear that gripped me, not like before. It was anticipation, raw and electric, crackling through the exhaustion and pain. Jack was out there. So close I could almost feel his sneer, his taunting drawl from that last call. Asterisk, closer than you know, asterisk, he'd wanted me to flinch, to cower behind Claire's locked doors. But I wasn't that woman anymore. The Emily he'd swung at was gone, buried under the wreckage he'd left behind. And what stood here now was something he wouldn't recognize, something he couldn't break. I turned from the window, meeting Claire's gaze. Her jaw was tight, her dark eyes blazing, but there was a question there too. A silent "Are you ready?" I didn't need to answer. She saw it in me, the steel that had hardened through every call, every threat, every swing of that damn bat. He's done, I said, my voice low but steady, cutting through the hum of the sirens. This ends tonight. Before she could respond, the building shuddered, a faint tremor like a truck rolling too close, but then came the crackle of radios echoing up from the street below. I pressed my face to the glass, peering down. Flashing lights painted the pavement red and blue, squad cars fanning out across the block, officers spilling out with hands on holsters. My heart slammed against my ribs, a wild rhythm I couldn't tame as I scanned the shadows for him, for Jack, lurking like a predator waiting to pounce. There, Claire said, stepping beside me, her finger jabbing at a flicker of movement near the alley across the street. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, moving fast, darted between the dumpsters, a glint of something in his hand catching the light. The bat. My stomach twisted, but my lips curled into something hard, something that wasn't quite a smile. He wasn't running away. He was coming closer. Sullivan's got him, Claire said, her voice tight with triumph as she pointed to the swarm of cops converging on the alley. Shouts rang out sharp and commanding. Drop it! Hands up! And I watched, breath held, as the figure froze, then bolted. The bat hit the ground with a dull clang, rolling into the gutter. And Jack, because it was him, I knew it in my bones, lunged for the shadows. But the net was too tight. Officers swarmed, cutting off his escape. And I saw the moment he realized it, the slump of his shoulders, the wild twist of his head as he looked for a way out that wasn't there. They took him down hard, a tangle of limbs and curses, pinning him to the asphalt. His face caught the light for a split second. Stubble, wild eyes. that sneer wiped clean by panic. And then he was gone, swallowed by the swarm of blue uniforms. Handcuffs clicked, radios buzzed, and the alley fell quiet, save for the fading echo of his shouts. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding, my good hand unclenching, nails leaving crescent marks in my palm. He's done, Claire said, echoing my words, her hand landing warm and firm on my good shoulder. They've got him, Em. I nodded, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the street. The bat lay there, abandoned, a chipped relic of the man I'd trusted, the man I'd poured 5 years into. Relief washed over me, cool and sudden, but it mingled with something else, lingering fear, a shadow that wouldn't quite lift. He was caught, yes, but the weight of him, the why of him, still pressed against my chest. I'd won this round, but it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. The balcony of my new apartment stretched out before me, a narrow strip of concrete perched above Atlanta's hum. The city glittered below, a sprawl of lights that no longer felt like a cage, and the evening breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from the planters I'd set out. I leaned against the railing, a glass of bourbon in my hand, the ice clinking softly as I raised it to my lips. The burn was smooth now, not jagged like it had been in those first weeks after the arrest. Claire stood beside me, her own glass catching the glow of the sunset, her blazer swapped for a sweater that softened her edges. To freedom, she said, lifting her drink, a grin tugging at her lips. To freedom, I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. The sound was crisp, final, a note of closure that rang through the quiet. We sipped in silence for a moment, the city's pulse a steady backdrop, and I let my gaze drift over the skyline, to the warehouse district, now just a shadow in the distance, to the life I'd left behind. It's over, I said, more to myself than to her, the words settling into me like a truth I'd fought to claim. Jack was gone, locked away, his back confiscated, his threats silenced. The fear that had clung to me like damp rot was fading, replaced by something lighter. Not peace, not yet, but possibility. Claire turned to me, her eyes warm but searching. You okay, Em? Really? I thought about it, rolling the question around in my mind. Was I okay? The bruises had healed, the sling was gone, but the scars, inside and out, lingered. The shock of his attack, the pain of his betrayal, the anger that had fueled me, they'd carved me into someone new, someone who'd faced him and won. I will be, I said, finally, my voice steady. He took a lot, but he didn't take me. She nodded, a flicker of pride in her smile. Damn right he didn't. You're tougher than he ever knew. I laughed, a small, quiet sound that surprised me, and took another sip. Tougher. Maybe I was. The woman who'd stood in that kitchen, envelope in hand, full of fragile hope. She was a memory now, a ghost I'd let go. What stood here on this balcony was someone who'd walked through fire and come out sharpened, not shattered. The future stretched out before me, uncharted and wide. An apartment of my own, a job I'd reclaim on my terms, a life I'd build without his shadow. There was healing to do, sure, and nights when the echo of that bat might wake me. But I'd face them the way I'd faced him in court, with a strength I'd earned the hard way. To starting over, I said, raising my glass again, the bourbon glinting gold in the fading light. Claire clinked hers against mine, her grin widening. To starting over, we drank, the city humming below, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight lift, not gone, but lighter, a burden I could carry. Jack had swung to break me, but I'd risen instead. And this view, this moment, this life was mine.